Oops. That was a little bit of an abrupt stop to that. I'm sorry about that. Good evening, Facebook family, Facebook friends. Welcome to the very first edition of our new Facebook Live web series, Coloring the Conversation on Perinatal Mental Health. We're going to be doing this every month. Keep a lookout. You got to be our friend on Facebook, follow our page because the time might vary because the folks we're talking to are experts in their field. They're experts on themselves and their experiences, and so we're gonna try to make sure that we can accommodate, their schedules. So keep an eye out on our Facebook live, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to or like our page so you can keep updated. I am Andrea Clark-Horton. I am the director for the Perinatal Mental Health Alliance for People of Color. We call it the Alliance here um, for Postpartum Support International, or PSI. And I am very excited about our conversation this evening. We have with us this evening for our first conversation, we have Miss Laudy Burgos, who is a licensed clinical social worker in New York. And I'm going to ask Laudy if she can just introduce herself to us and tell us about how she became involved with the Alliance and PSI first off, after you tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hi, Andrea. It's so nice to share this space with you. I'm so excited to talk about this. It's such a huge topic. We definitely need to talk about it. So as Andrea mentioned, I am a clinical social worker in New York City. And I've been working at Mount Sinai Hospital and OBGYN for 24 years, and 20 of those years in OBGYN, working with women with perinatal mood disorders and women who've experienced perinatal losses. And I've been involved with PSI for quite a number of years, maybe for the past 10 years. And I want to say I joined the Alliance shortly after it started a few years ago. And I was on the board, and I'm actually now on the board, the PSI board for the past maybe almost a year. And yeah, I'm excited to, I became part of the board really because PSI sort of took the Alliance as a program under it, right? So I'm sort of the representative. So I'm really happy that I'm still part of the Alliance and serving in that capacity.
Yeah, we're really happy too. I know that I am. Laudy has been such a great ally and fierce advocate for the Alliance. And as you said, you've been around since about 2017 with the Alliance, since the Alliance started. All right. Okay, Laudy, let's talk about, so we're going to talk tonight about perinatal loss and the silence around perinatal loss in the Latinx community. As our friends who are joining us may or may not know, October is Infant and Pregnancy Loss Awareness Month, right? And then during October, we also had Hispanic Heritage Month. They kind of dovetail with one another, right? And so I thought this was an opportune time to kind of have this conversation, and something that I think is close to your heart, as well. But before we get into kind of the cultural aspects of thinking about loss, and specifically with the Latinx community, can you tell me what is perinatal loss, and why don't people like to talk about it?
So when we talk about perinatal loss, right, we talk about any type of pregnancy loss during the course of someone being pregnant. So you can have a pregnancy loss, very early at a couple of weeks of pregnancy, you may be 20 weeks, pregnant. And it also includes any stillbirths, right? So it's not just early pregnancy, it's any type of loss of a baby when you are pregnant.
Okay. And so that's from, you said, is it the same thing as is miscarriage, the same as loss, or where? So you're saying it's all under that umbrella?
Yep. So miscarriage is absolutely, yeah, it's really important, Andrea. I'm so glad you said that because people use different terms and sometimes it is very confusing, but miscarriage is absolutely falls under perinatal loss because it's really the loss of a pregnancy. So
Okay.
absolutely.
So I know we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about, the cultural aspects of this in terms of like um, how these issues are talked about in the Latinx community. But I find, and I came to BSI after being a hospital chaplain in women's health for about 6 years here in Chicago, where I am. And I find that there's just a lot of silence around this, period. I co-facilitated the support group for our families that experience loss with one of my beautiful former co-workers, Susan Rosado, who's a licensed clinical social worker. And a lot of times what the parents would say to us in that group is like, I feel like this is almost like a secret society. Like, that other people are part of it, but nobody ever talks about it. So you don't know who. And you don't, so because of that, you don't know how to navigate this. Why is this something that people just don't talk about?
I like what you mentioned. You made such a good point that this is really pregnancy loss is a taboo topic in all cultures, right? And in all of society. But I think, I mean, you and I have talked that in the Latinx culture in particular, right? It's an even more close conversation. But I think in general, in all groups, it is very taboo. It's not something that we talk about because I think, the media, society, the way they portray motherhood is right. It's like this beautiful thing and everything's supposed to go well and you take care of yourself. And then, there's this expectation, sadly, right, that if you are a woman, right, you're going to get pregnant, you're going to have these children and you're going to have a certain amount of, number of kids and things are going to go well and you're going to parent them. And then that is so limiting, right? Because we know now that there are individuals that get pregnant that don't identify as women, right? So that's one thing, right? We also know that there are some pregnancies that end in loss, right? And I think the reason, again, it is taboo is because sadly, a lot of individuals who have losses end up feeling a lot of shame
Yeah.
about the loss because they feel that they did something wrong. So there is that guilt aspect of it, right? Did I do something? And then there is another aspect of almost embarrassment that my body failed me, right? What's wrong with me that I couldn't carry this pregnancy to term? Why can't I be like other individuals who have successful pregnancies?
Yes. Yeah, no, and I can definitely identify that I have a little boy who's 9, but prior to having him, I'd lost 3 early pregnancy losses, and it felt like, especially somebody who's been to college, I'm fairly well educated, and I'm just the kind of person that I can put my mind to something and I can do it, right? And so it feels like I felt this really overwhelming sense of failure because this is something that I felt like people who didn't even want to have babies or didn't even want to have kids and were able to do, and this is something I really wanted, and this is one thing I put my mind to, and I tried, and I went to the doctor and I did everything they told me, and it still wasn't working. So right, there's this huge sense of shame. And is that true still in Latinx culture? And I know we want to be culturally like sensitive here, right? So we don't want to in any way suggest that everyone who identifies as Latino, Latina, Hispanic, or any of those other kind of uh, cultural groups, or anyone who speaks Spanish or is a native speaker, like that all cultures and all the nationalities under that speak Spanish, that have Spanish as their primary language, are the same, right? So I want to clear that up. But there are some cultural similarities I know, and when I think about this in the African American context, particularly as Christians, African American Christians, because I'm also a minister, there are some things that are similar, right? So we're going to talk from that perspective. Like, so are there some things that are kind of common reasons why you think is this a different way of talking about or thinking about this issue in Latinx culture in general?
So first of all, I just want to say to you, thank you for sharing that. And I'm so sorry that you experienced those losses. And as you were talking about how you felt, I was thinking, right, there are, like you said, a lot of similarities between, even though we're talking about Latinx today, I always find that there are so many similarities between the African American, Black communities and Latinx, right? And even some other cultures. And I think, you know, the thing with I know specifically for Latinx, but again, this may be true for other cultures, is we have Latinos have some really beautiful values surrounding the importance of family, right? However, right, with that value comes assumptions regarding the natural fertility of individuals and their journey to motherhood. And there's this emphasis on taking care of your body, right? But also in having faith that everything will work out, right? And I remember my grandmother saying,
Mhm.
everything's todo va a salir bien, everything's gonna be okay. You just have to eat, you just have, and then there's this and there's this sort of like religious thing. And again, not all Latinos, like you said, I'm very glad you said that, Andrea, because I don't want to generalize. But for many Latinos, especially our grandmothers, even if we're not very religious, or they'll talk about God, and God is going to be watching, and God is going to make sure you're okay. So there's sort of like this pressure, but also this reassurance sometimes that we want to believe so bad, and life just doesn't pan out like that for everyone, right? And I think that also in our communities, there's sort of like this big expectation of, again, what a woman's supposed to do and look like, right? And you need to be able to cook, and you need to be able to take care of a home, and you have to keep your man happy, and all these things. But also there's sort of like these values from messages we hear very early on. Like I remember, and a lot of my friends talk about this, how from a young age, the minute you have your period, even that in itself is like, make sure you hide your pad. No one should know you had your period. Cover it up, put it in the bag. And there's all this, like, even taboo about bleeding, a woman's bleeding. Let's not about it. Oh my God, they see you have to cover up, right? And then there's also this taboo about sex, right? If you have sex, you can get pregnant. Don't have sex until you're married because you can get pregnant. And so there's all these sort of taboos just about sex and about everything, right? And so then, sadly, in our communities, the other thing is there's this, belief that if people find out, they're going to talk about us. If people find out, they're going to like wonder and judge and wonder why. And so that, can often become really problematic because, for instance, I remember, and this is true for many subjects, drug use and stuff like that, right? We don't talk about that. Or,
Sexual abuse is another one of those things that,
so it becomes this thing, this fear of saying it because you're going to be judged, or even there's this sort of competition, sadly, sometimes. And it happens in a lot of our communities, right? That my daughter got pregnant, yours is, had this issue. Why did she do it? Don't say anything. Let's just pretend you weren't pregnant, or let's just pretend something, happened. You'll get pregnant again. Well, and there's sort of, and then it just perpetuates. And so that's what creates this stigma and this taboo. And it's very sad because then that's what makes individuals not want to talk about loss, because they know there's all this, all these ideas surrounding that. And even within families.
yeah.
I had a patient that had a loss. And, I went upstairs to help my worker with this particular patient. And, she was there. She has an 18-year-old son. And now she has a new partner. And, they have, I want to say maybe an 8-year-old daughter, and was pregnant again. And it was very interesting, the dynamic. When I walked in, I started talking about the loss, and you immediately saw the man, right? The father of the baby, kind of really stoic, like almost like he was holding himself together. And it was, you could tell it was a lot of work he was putting into, a lot of effort into keeping it together. And the woman, the patient was sort of crying appropriately and stuff like that. But again, even she was sort of like holding herself a little bit so she wouldn't like completely sob. And, one of the things I said, I'm really sorry about your loss. And I said, and I just want you to know that while we're having this discussion, if you want to cry, if you want to be upset, if you want to scream, all that is good here, right? And immediately she just sort of like unloaded. And I said, wow, she had been holding that all day. And he started to tear, but almost like angry that he was doing that. And we started going through the stuff I always go through. I always review with them, your mind knows you're no longer pregnant, but it takes your body a while to know you're no longer pregnant. So your breasts are going to be engorged. You're going to have these feelings. You're going to have, and how did you deal with this? And how do you deal with that? I often tell them it's very common after a pregnancy loss for you to feel like you're watching a movie in your head about the same thing happen.
Yeah.
I told them it's, very common that they have these vivid dreams, nightmares. So I sort of like review all that. And then we get to the part where we are talking about, how are we going to explain this? How are you planning to explain this to your daughter who knows that mom's pregnant? She was like, a couple of months pregnant. We talked a little bit about that. And even that was interesting because mom is very spiritual. And she was like, well, I'm going to talk to her about God. And I talked specific terms, right? You want to make sure you say, if you're going to talk about spiritually, baby went to heaven. You don't want to say mommy lost the baby, right? A child lost where, so talked about developmentally appropriate things. And then dad was very much like, I'm angry at God. So our community, right? That's really important. And sometimes not being on the same page about that creates also silence, right? Because you're angry, but you feel guilty because, my mother and my grandmother are going to be angry at me if I'm angry at God, and I'm going to have to hear it. So I'm just not going to discuss it, right? So there's that piece. But the other interesting piece was that, he immediately kind of started, I said to him, and to the couple, I said, one of the things I talk to my patients about is, how are you going to tell people, right? Clearly, she's like 6 or 7 months pregnant. People saw her. People knew she was pregnant. And, I talked to them about how painful it can be, right? When you see someone, especially if you just have the loss, you still haven't lost all that pregnancy weight. And someone's like, oh, how's pregnancy going? How's the baby? And then you have to say, I am no longer pregnant. Or, just a couple of months down the road, someone sees you, where's the baby? So I said to them what I tell all my patients, let's come up with one thing you say to everyone. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to be, like you're already in pain. You don't have to like make that sort of effort. And immediately, before we even came up with the phrase, before we even finished talking about it, he said, well, I'm very upset at her son because he already told her brother. And so I said, okay, well, tell me a little bit about that. Like, how did that happen? Like, how did this disclosure happen? I'm not understanding. And I got a little bit more information. Turns out this couple and their daughter share an apartment with the patient's brother and his wife. So they all live together, right? And that's common in families of color, right? Sometimes there's like space, you live with your aunt, your brother.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and this, her son is an 18-year-old son. He knew that she had gone to the hospital. And I can imagine, right? Like she went to the hospital and her brother and his sister and his wife saying to the son, is she okay? What happened? Right? And so he said she had a loss. And this Latino father was very upset about that. He felt it wasn't the son's place to disclose this. And it was very interesting to me, right? Because to me, it sort of made sense. Well, they all live in the same house. They saw her leave. They were worried. But this father was sort of, again, feeding into this sort of silence and said, like, we really shouldn't say. And I said to him, well, what do you think, like, what was going to happen when she went back home? And then he said, I said, is the issue that you didn't say it, that you felt it was your story to share? I get that. But for him, that it was just that it was disclosed. And he was like, we may not be ready to talk about it. So that's how much it is a taboo, that even within your own family, sometimes there is a disclosure.
There are these different ways of like dealing with it. And so I think that's interesting that you brought, that's a great, like, what a great example. And I think it's interesting that you brought up this idea of them, there are a couple things that struck me, but this last point about um, sometimes we don't talk about it because we're not on the same page we're not at the same place in how we're grieving. We're not grieving this the same way, and we're not on the same page about whether or not talking about it is going to be helpful because of all these other questions it invites then, right? And so, and the stuff that you might not want to hear as dad who's angry at God. Like, so we tell everybody, and then my aunt and my great aunt and my grandma and my mom are all saying, well, just pray about it, and and you have an angel in heaven now, and God will send you another baby. And I don't even want to talk about God right now, right? And so then let's just not bring it up, because I don't want all of these other things, or for people to start asking these really invasive and personal questions, right? About, so what did the doctor say was wrong? Um, maybe you're a little too old to be doing this, maybe there's some fertility treatments, or you might need to, think about, about doing fertility treatments or help, or those kind of things. And people, I think, out of the abundance of wanting to help, sometimes say things that are like less than helpful, right? Yeah.
I've had Latina patients who said to me that an aunt or a friend or a neighbor, sometimes a little older, right, with like very sort of like old-fashioned ideas, will say once they find out, what happened? Weren't you taking care of yourself? Did
Yes.
you lift anything heavy? Did you drink coffee? What did you do? Like
Mhm.
that right there is like you're being blamed. You're already feeling embarrassed that you're a failure, your body failed you, but then you have someone sort of like confirming that in some way, even though it's not true, right? But it feels that way when they're saying, did you not take care of yourself?
Right. Right. Yes. Yeah. Or
Andrea, too, that I think about this is talk about silence, that once it does happen, and I think this is true for the Black community too, that you know you're you're finally with your family or with a certain group or a friend, and you're crying, and this happened, and then all of a sudden the auntie, the mother, the grandmother, the abuela, the tia will say, "This happened to me. I had a loss," and
mm,
then you're like, "Did
nobody said anything. Like, nobody told me that.
about this?" So that's another interesting phenomenon that happens, that you all of a sudden you go through it and you hear about all these family members that went through it that you had no idea because they never ever talked about it.
Well, yeah, it's funny because of my mom, who she's never experienced this a loss, and she told me that since I was having as I was going through my loss of, she says to me now regularly, she's so happy that I work at PSI. She loved when I was doing my chaplain work. She's like, this is just so necessary for us to be able to have a space to talk about it, because this is not something that we ever talked about. And I remember her saying, when after my first pregnancy loss, my grandmother, who, God rest her soul, my paternal grandmother, um, my mom was actually talking to her, and she's the one that told my grandmother that I had miscarried. And my grandmother, who was probably then in her 80s, told my mother, "Oh yeah, I know. I That happened between my dad and my dad's younger brother. There's 5 years, and she had a loss between them." And so she's like, "Yeah, I know." She tells my mother that. Now I saw my grandmother for years after that, and she still never said anything to me. But my mother and father had been married for 30 some odd years at that point, and that's my mother was like, that's the first time she's said that to me. And so it's just kind of one of these things where kind of you feel like um the silence around it is because for me, I felt like I was not always given full permission to grieve, right? It's like it's not something you grieve, right?
That. Why do you think, Andrew? Why do you think, especially women of color, feel that
Yeah. Well, I mean, I got a whole host of like ideas about why I think that. Um, but there's this notion. I think for women in general, but I think for especially for women of color, there is this notion that we're supposed to be strong, right?
That's
Right.
exactly what I was
You can bear the weight of the world on your shoulder. You take care of everybody, and there's no time for you to grieve this
remember,
because
Andrea, we heard this growing up. You know, the grandmother, I remember growing up, always hearing your grandmother came here, she had 6 kids that she left behind in Costa Rica, and she, was like sweeping floors and cooking so that she could get her kids here and have a better life. And now you're fortunate, so it's like this, wow. And listen, she was strong. No one's saying she wasn't, but again, there's sort of like these notions that we have to be strong, we have to do this. And it's really hard then, because then you're almost made to feel like, right, as a mother, I can't complain. And if you have a loss, you just have to keep it moving,
right.
because you have other kids at home and that they can't be impacted. They can't see you upset. And that's something that I've been very intentional in my parenting about, that when there was a death, I told my kids and I took them to the wake, and I took them, and this is part of life. You can't have your kids in a bubble, right? And part of it is in our community, sometimes that's what happens, that we're not going to expose you to that. You're not old enough to see that, but then this is why you're not exposed and you don't know how to talk about it. This is how silence then perpetuates. You kind of learn that and live your life with those secrets. And it's really hard because there was a time where we came from these villages and campos where there were these natural built-in communities that supported us.
Right.
Not what it's like. So like now we have to be intentional about supporting and nurturing each other, and that and a big part of that comes with really opening up the dialogue.
Yeah.
Comes to sexual health, reproductive health, loss, postpartum depression, all of those.
Right. We have to talk about it. So the notion about a silence though. So sometimes I'm wondering, Natalie, if there's ever a time when silence in these circumstances, and as we think about, I think this is generally applicable, right? But even in culturally specific contexts, is there a time when silence is ever good, right? And how do we know when silence is good? How do we know when we should do something, either as the person who's going through, or the person or partner who's going through this loss? How do we know when it's okay to shatter the silence or to break the silence and to say something? How do we know as people who love people who are going through this? Like, when do I say something? And what do I say? Or do I just let them be? Or how do you know?
Excellent question, and I mean, in general, I want to start by saying that the ability to grieve openly, right, about cope as they struggle to make sense of that loss, especially when the pregnancy was something they really desired. And when they don't talk about it, right, couples end up feeling isolated, resentful, um, desire to discuss this miscarriage is neglected. But I think that, as someone who wants to support them, first of all, it's really important not to trivialize the loss. And you mentioned some of that, Andrea, like saying, well, if the baby's now, a flower in heaven, or it's an angel that's going to watch over you, or, you're young, you can have more, or you have three other ones.
Or at least you didn't know the baby. At least it was early. Like some people have said that to me.
Absolutely. And that's often something, right? Oh, but at least it wasn't born and you never, it's horrible. And so the first and foremost, do not trivialize the loss, right? A miscarriage, a pregnancy loss is it's emotionally and physically painful. And it can mean the loss of dreams and hopes that you had for your future family and parenthood. So one thing I always say as a supporter is always take that loss seriously, no matter what. Again, there are families that have 6, 7 children. Maybe that was the 8th child. You can't assume that it's not important because they have 7 other children, right? Secondly, I would say to really resist the urge to offer advice. Right. Sometimes we think when we're uncomfortable with talking about certain things, we immediately jump to offer that advice. So just sometimes giving the person that space to vent and to cry and express their emotions is more important than telling them what to do next. And then finally, I think it's important to acknowledge the man also, or the partner rather, right? Feel that grief of that pregnancy loss. Even though, the individual that's pregnant experiences the loss in a way that is undeniably unique, right? For many reasons, men also benefit from talking about the loss and processing it. They had hopes and dreams too. And then they are also holding their wife's griefs and feeling like, I can't grieve because I have to be there for my partner. So I think, so it's important to talk about it for all these reasons. But I think also you asked about silence. Is there ever a time where it's good? And there are times, right? So, I have patients that have friends or family members that are a little overbearing, right? That are going to go into giving advice, or, and maybe they mean well, but, it's sort of like that aunt that's like, hi, baby, come over here. Let me talk to you. And it's just when you don't want to hear it, and maybe it's well-intentioned, and maybe you love that aunt, but you just don't want to hear her yelling and come hugging on you. Maybe that's not what you want. You want to sort of be in your own shell. So I think I always tell my patients, right, as much as I encourage them to talk about it so they can breathe and make sense of this loss, I think there is a time to be silent, and there's a time to, let others hear your voice. And so for some of them, I tell them, if you feel that disclosing to this person, it's going to cause all these unwanted reactions or whatever, then maybe do not disclose to them yet. Maybe give yourself a month till you talk to that person, right? If it's possible. Sometimes it's not possible because we know, Andrea, in communities of color, you tell one person and then all of a sudden the whole block knows, right? So that can be a challenge, but as much as you can, right? And I often tell families, look, there's no and when you have to tell, you tell. So if for me, it means that I'm going to wait a week or 2 before I tell anyone, because I just want to be with my partner and my family and just deal with it there, that's fine. So sometimes it's okay that way. But as much as possible, we want to break that cycle of that stigma. So I would encourage them to talk about it. And
So what do I say though if I'm a mom or a birthing person and I've experienced this loss, and I do have that overbearing tia, or that overbearing grandma, or whatever, or that really well-intentioned friend who may have even had a similar experience, and they want to rush in, and they want me to talk about it. They want to hug me. They want to bring me food every day. They want to out of they're out of an abundance of love for you, but it's too much. So what do I say, or what are some things that I can, use as tools to be able to lovingly tell people I need a minute. I think what I did was, and I did this when my father passed away too, is like text message might seem like an impersonal way to communicate something, but I I did a group text to like a few close friends and told them what happened and said, hey, right now I just don't I just want you to know what's going on with me. You can feel free to check in by texting me, but I just don't want to talk to anybody right now. You know, is and I appreciate your prayers and your love, your thoughts from afar, cards, it's fine, and whatever, emails. I don't want to talk on the phone. I don't want visitors. But I was at a place, um, probably by the second or third loss where I felt like I was able to do that. But if this is new for me, and this is something that I know, my family loves me, and they want to come and pray for me, and they want to give this advice, and I don't know how to, what do I do?
So one of the things, it's interesting because you said a text may be impersonal, but actually that's one of the things we recommend for patients to do.
Mhm.
We tell our patients all the time, um, if you can, right, you can just say to the person who's calling you or whatever, right now, I'm so grateful, I'm so appreciative of the love, I feel your love, but right now, I just need some time to process this, right?
Mhm.
Appreciate it. I don't want you to think that I don't, want your support, but right now I just need a little bit of time. But that's hard for people to do, right? And a lot of times, again, in communities of color, if you say that, then you may get like, yes, but no, you have to, we have to take care of you. That's going to make you feel better. So
Mhm.
we actually recommend that you send a text or an email, just saying, I just want to let you know or I have experienced a loss, and I appreciate your prayers. Please pray for me and my family that we find comfort. But I'm gonna need a couple of weeks, or I'm gonna need some time to process this. And when I feel better, I will reach out to you. Thank you for understanding, right? So that's sort of what we sometimes advise, but also one of the ideas we've sort of like thrown out to patients is assigning someone, right?
Right.
Whether
That's gonna be my. Mhm.
your sister or the mom, someone that's kind of neutral that can keep it together, and that person is going to go and say, this is what's happened. Andrea's not feeling her best right now, as you can imagine.
Mhm.
And she wanted me to tell you that this is what's happening. She's gonna be okay physically, but it's gonna take her a little while. Fortunately, she appreciates your prayers and your support, but at this point, she really, really just needs some time.
Yeah, I was gonna say that very thing, Laudy, and I I would do that with when I was in the hospital with the as a chaplain. I would tell my patients who also had like new diagnoses of other illness, like if they got a cancer diagnosis, and people are gonna wonder how you're doing, but can you pick somebody who you trust, who's not gonna get on your nerves, like wanting to know every update about what's happening today, and did the test come back from the doctor to say like did they do the genetic testing to see if something was wrong with it? That's not going to do that to you,
Right.
but who you can trust to communicate this information in a really effective way to the folks who you want to know, right? And to be okay with putting your phone on silent or do not disturb, right? Yeah, because it saves you some space. And then I have such wonderful friends. My son, after he was born, he was sick. He had a urinary tract infection. He was in the hospital. And I think I told maybe three or four people. And then my wonderful like support network asked if they could share. And so they shared with other people that I knew. And I had like a meal train coming, like bringing stuff to the hospital, or they would bring gift cards so that we could eat, get things to eat. And so even those things that I didn't think that I need or wanted, but they didn't bother to come up to the hospital because it's not what I wanted, right?
But that you make a really good point, Andrea, because I think, yes, I think it's fine to really advocate for what your needs are. But I think you make another interesting point, and we do tell patients this also, right? That um, allow yourself to be in that role of someone that needs to be careful, right? Especially, I always tell my patients, you're always the caregiver. You're usually the one that's caring for others. Allow us to take care of you here. And when you go home, allow someone else to take care of you. And then we talk about that, right? What are ways where you can receive that support, right? Receive that support, but without having to talk to anyone. So, so maybe that email or that text or that designated person will say, she really appreciates your prayers. And yes, if you want to send her, you want to make something, she will accept that. You can give it to me. I'll drive it to her, or, I can get it to her, but she's just not able. And, and really, and I use, spirituality and faith is really important for in our communities of color, especially, I think. And for a long time, I remember in social work school when I went a long time ago, Andrea. So it was like taboo to even, like, you couldn't talk, you can't cry with a patient, you can't talk about religion, you can't, and that has changed so much. So listen, I was doing it right after I graduated. Like, I was just defying all those rules and kind of like saying, no, my community, this is what we do. And, I talk. So if a patient, obviously I don't do it unless they bring it up, but if they talk about God, if they talk about, then I'll say, girl, you accept the blessing. We need to take care of you now. Accept that meal. Let them take care of you, but you can still establish some boundaries to make sure that you are just getting or doing just what you are able to tolerate. So it's, you can accept something, but say, but I can't see you right now, right? And that's it. And whoever wants to do it does it, and whoever doesn't, and, and giving also people permission to sort of say, or just letting them know that they don't have control over anyone, right? And inevitably, like you said, people will not only say inappropriate things, but they will get upset. Believe that you didn't want to talk to me and we're so close. And I tell my patients all the time, that's their issue, not your issue.
Exactly. I was going to say, I'm so glad you said that, Laudy, because one of the things that I used to tell my patients and parents is like, if there's any time in the world for you to be selfish, right? And I think this goes back to that notion of what it means to be strong. And so it means that for a lot of times for folks of color, that what it means to be strong is that I've got to take care of everybody all the time, right? So that point about getting over this, like, you should just be over this and get back to it, because you've got stuff to do and other kids to care for and a job to get back to and a husband or a spouse to tend to, or whatever the case may be. But the other piece of that is like, so the expectation is that in my grief, I've got to tend to you, right? So I would say all the time, like, if there's ever a time to be selfish right now, like, if you're going to be offended because as I'm working through this really difficult thing, that you're going to be offended because I said I can't take your phone call, or if you can just drop the food over to my sister who'll bring it to me instead of you bringing it to me, if that's going to offend you so much, I don't have space for that right now too, and it's okay.
And the reason you need to be okay with that is boundaries, is because if not, people are going to say things that are going to make you feel judged and make you feel bad and make you feel all kinds of things. And again, there is a tendency in our community, maybe sometimes well-intentioned, but very harmful, this thing about, well, let me feed you or let me take care of you because you can try getting pregnant again next month, right? You have, after you've gone through something like that, you have to heal physically and emotionally. And I remember, my mom, well, one time I remember someone in our family had a loss, and she insisted she had to go to the pharmacy in the community where we lived, and she came back with this compound. It's like this syrup they sell in Latino neighborhoods, and it's called, now it's something some of the people here who, if they're Latino, may have heard about it, but it's called La Señora Muller. It's like Miss Muller or something like that. And it's like a syrup. It's like a compound and a thing. And people who are trying to get pregnant drink it, and it's supposed to clean your uterus, clean it, right? And I remember saying to my mom, "What are you doing? What are you thinking?" And she was like, "No, but this is really good. It's supposed to clean your uterus and you get pregnant." And I'm like, do you think that person like wants to, not to mention that I heard it tastes disgusting. It's like the kind of like brown syrupy, and I think about how harmful that can be, right? Imagine, especially, I mean, and the thing is, in our community, there are things we believe. We definitely have curanderos and like folk healers, and some of us believe that certain things, and sometimes it does happen, right?
Right.
But it can also be harmful because if someone is thinking, okay, yeah, this is gonna, and then it doesn't, it's like another letdown, it's like grieving all over again. So
Right, right. I want to mention that if any of our Facebook Live watchers, if you have questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat on the Facebook Live. If it's something that you feel uncomfortable with putting it in the live, feel free to send our PMHA-POC page a DM, a direct message, and if we can get to it, we'll get somebody will get back to you. I don't know if we'll be able to monitor those right now to see, but please, if you have questions, comments, if you can relate to any of this, let us know. um Laudy, as you were just talking, I was thinking about I have a I'm no longer married. I'm divorced, but one of my family members, um from my ex-husband's side of the family, it would be the way of sharing love and like how I can help you heal is that there's this automatic assumption that I want to get pregnant again right away. And so that came with advice about, well, next time, after sex, put your legs up in the air like this, or don't get up for 30 minutes, and because you want to have a baby. So it's the assumption that the way for me to heal from this loss is that I want to get um pregnant again
right,
right away.
right.
So how do I know, kind of like when I'm ready, and then how do I communicate that to my abuela and my my tio and my tia and my cousin and my best friend? Like, how do I communicate like I'm really not just ready? And then one more thing, because we got to wrap up, I think somebody the other thing I want you to kind of speak to is if I am struggling with my own sadness and having nobody to talk to because nobody's been through this and they're being pushy with me, but I really want to talk about this with somebody. Like, how do I find resources? How do I find the strength to even go and look for something to help me?
No, good points. And I think that to answer the first question, right? It's teaching our patients how to have a voice and how to use that voice, right? It's not even finding their voice. I always say, when people say, well, to find your voice, we all have a voice. You don't have to be there. How do we use it, right? And sometimes people just need a little help and a little push, right? So I tell my patients all the time just to say, when your abuela, when your auntie starts talking about this, just say, Titi, please, I'm not ready to hear that. But when I'm ready, if I want to talk about it, I'm going to come to you. Real and very sort of like, to the point. You can't beat around the bush, right? And that happens in our communities a lot. I know I grew up with my parents, especially if you're talking to someone that's older than you, whatever, and you say something out of place, and you get that look right immediately. Afterwards, why did you say that? That's disrespect, like all these things. There is a way to say, live your truth and say without being nasty, without being disrespectful. And I think say very directly, I tell my patients, when you have a loss, right? And you don't want to hear these well-meaning or annoying like people say these things to you, you have to set the limit and you have to be direct, and you can do that in a respectful way. But even just saying, like I said, I don't know when I'll be ready to get pregnant again. I don't know if I'm going to be ready. Maybe one day I will, but that's not on my mind right now. Right now, I'm focusing on healing. This was devastating to me. And
Mm-hmm.
I just, you know what? I can't even go there right now. I can't, I don't even have the bandwidth to think about that. So I would say saying it very directly. And then you can say something nice and say, but you know what? Your support has meant so much to me. And thank you. And now I know that when I'm ready, you are one of the people that I can come and talk to about this. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how I would deal with that. And, then just in terms of someone who has gone through a loss and what they can do, I would say, first of all, telling their story is super powerful. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard, but I really encourage my patients to tell their story, because when you tell your story, you make some sort of sense of the loss, and you are able to grieve, right? And, even people who say, I lost my baby. I always say, what was your baby's name?
I know. Yeah.
I lost, Sarah. And I'll say, well, tell me about the hopes and dreams you had for Sarah.
Yeah.
Um, and, like, what was it like being pregnant in the beginning, and sort of engaging them and sort of making peace with that. So it's really important to tell your story. I think attending a support group. I don't know if you attended a support group when you had your losses, Andrea, but we have a couple of support groups here. Not just for parents who've had just losses, that sort of just happen spontaneously, but we even have a support group for parents who had to terminate for anomalies, for medical anomalies. And all these groups are so therapeutic, because it's like you said, it's almost like a secret society. But what I like about it, right, is that you can come, everyone has gone through the same thing. They have gone through a lot of similar things, with people telling them things, with them not wanting to say. And here they can talk openly about how appropriate this person was when they told me that, or how it felt when my friend who was also pregnant and due at the same time had that baby.
And a
And
baby.
I
Mm-hmm.
can't tell her how angry I feel,
Mm-hmm.
because that's going to hurt her feelings, and she's not going to get it. I'm not angry at her, and I'm happy for her, but it's that anger, because that would have been my baby right now. We would have been sitting there holding our babies, and you are, and I have an empty,
Right.
empty. And so, a support group is really powerful. Sometimes maybe even needing therapy, talking to someone one-on-one, because sometimes it's hard to talk about these feelings of loss even with your partner. Sometimes you're not on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
These are all things that I think, and then doing anything that you enjoy doing, whether that is praying. I encourage people, if going to church is something that helps you, do that. If yoga is what you do, then do that. So anything that can bring you some joy,
Yeah.
have those moments. And the thing is, right, I tell my patients, don't feel guilty about having moments of joy. And I always tell them, death is very interesting, right? And I always tell people, you probably will never get over this loss. So I always tell them, don't let anyone tell you that you're going to get over this. But I always say, just because you're grieving doesn't mean you have moments of joy. It may be a minute, it may be 10 minutes, it may be an hour, but you can grieve and have moments of joy at the same
Have
time.
moments of joy. I loved when I was working with my patients, and especially if they delivered, and to watch them hold, the baby, um, even the baby is no longer living, but to watch them hold the baby and to dress them in the clothes that they bought from them, because this is, my mom bought this the day she found out I was pregnant. And so I'm going to dress my baby in this, and to see them hold that baby and laugh like, oh my God, with their partner. Oh, she's got your big feet. Oh, he's got, look at those eyelashes, just like, his, like her sister. And to encourage that joy, and I talk to the baby with them and let them know that's okay. Right. And like you said, I want to thank you, Laudy, for being my very first guest on Coloring the Conversation. We're going to do this again next month,
Yeah.
but you were super awesome, super helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. And again, as Laudy said, that there are support groups that PSI runs virtually. There are support groups for Latinx moms. There are support groups for moms who have experienced loss, moms whose families, I'm sorry, whose babies and birthing people whose babies are in the NICU. There are support groups for male partners, for dads. And so go to postpartum.net and you will find PSI's webpage there. You can find, even under the Alliance, under the Join Us tab, you'll find the Alliance homepage. And then you can link to the provider directory. So if you're looking for somebody in your area who may be a provider of color, who you feel like I'd rather talk to somebody who kind of looks like me and maybe speaks the same language as I do, so we can have that common starting place. Like, all of the folks on there are people who we have vetted. Most of them have the perinatal mental health certification. So they're folks that are trained and passionate about this area of work, to be able to walk with you through these seasons and these issues. And then there's a listing of all of our support groups and when they meet. So please, please, please take advantage of those resources. Laudy, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you all for watching with us, and stay tuned again, like our page so you can see when we have our next conversation coming up next month. All right. You all have a good evening. Have a great weekend, Laudy.
Here, bye-bye.
Bye.